Okay, good morning. At least right now it's morning here. So here we go. We have a report by the United Nations in 2000 that there was a higher rate of illiteracy in men than women in the country of Qatar. You pronounce it how you want to, and I'll pronounce it how I'm told that it's supposed to be pronounced. So a humanitarian organization went to Qatar to conduct a random sample. They revealed that from their results, their random sample of 234 men, 45 were illiterate, and out of 251 women, 42 were illiterate on the same measurement test. So these results are independent of each other. Do these results indicate that the United Nations findings are correct? So we're going to test a hypothesis and state our conclusion. So there's X and X and N, and we're going to find p hats. But first, we have to define that M, our subscript we're going to use, stands for Qatar men, and W is Qatar women. You may have just said men and women or male and female, and that's fine. I'm just going to be a little bit more specific. And so I have the X and N's for the men. And from that, from X sub M equals 45 and N equals 234, I get 45 divided by 234 is 0.19 and some change. And then my Q hat for men is 0.81. Do the same thing with the women. 42 illiterate women and 251 Qatar women. I didn't write that because we'd already defined those as Qatar up here. Qatar, sorry. So PW, P hat is 0.17, Q hat 0.83 for the women. My alpha is 0.05, and my null hypothesis is the men and women have the same proportion of illiteracy, where, and this is a parameter, and my alternative is that the men's proportion is greater than the women's. So I looked at my conditions. If I can get my piece of paper here out of the way. We said that each group of men and women were randomly selected, and it says that in the paragraph. 234 is less than 10% of all Qatar men, and 251 is less than 10% of all Qatar women. Then we found NP of the men was 45, NQ of the women is 189. Because they gave us those numbers over here, we're just going to continue to use them because that's where we got the percents from. The NP for the women is 42, the NQ for the women is 209. Those are all greater than or equal to at least 10 successes and failures. So the conditions are met to run a two proportion z-test. And so I'm going to move this piece of paper out of the way because we don't need it anymore. So here we go. So I set up, excuse me. First thing I want to do, since we have a two proportions for the z, I pulled my numbers to find my p hat for the pair. So I added their x's and added their n's and found that proportion is 0.179. And I left that as 0.179. It could have made it as 18, but I left it as 0.179. So found this people p hat q hat over the number of men plus p hat q hat over the number of women, close my parentheses there, equals 0.0349 or 0348. I don't remember exactly, but I rounded it to 0.035. I then found the difference of our p hats from above minus 0, which is the assumed difference, where you say there's no difference between the two, and divided by my standard error. And that gives me a z-score of 0.571. And so from that, I'll do the probability of z being greater than 0.571 is about 0.2369. That was the p-value when I ran the test on the calculator. So running the test on the calculator, this is a two proportion z-test. It's number 6. Got all my numbers written in there. And there it gives me my z-score. Now it gives me a different z for this. And I probably should have done it this way and put 0.57, but it doesn't matter. We're good to go. And it gives me my p hats and my q hats. And it gives me the combined p hat of 0.179. Hope everybody sees that. And there's my x and n's. So high p-value. High p-value, 2.369. So conclusion, with such a high p-value, I can't get the piece of paper out of the way. With such a high p-value compared to alpha, which we wrote over here, we failed to reject the null hypothesis. There is not enough evidence to conclude the illiteracy rate in men is higher than women in Qatar. Okay, we had a high p-value. We had a low z-score. These are kind of the opposite of each other, if you will. With a high z-score, we get a low p-value. With a low z-score, we get a high p-value. And then it asks us to run a confidence interval to find the difference in the proportions. So that's going to be p hat of men minus the p hat of women, plus or minus the z star of the standard error. And running the test, and I'll just show you that test real quick. This is B for this one, a 2 proportion z interval. And once you put the numbers in for the 2 proportion z test, it also puts them in the interval. And I calculate it, and it gives me these two numbers, which I rounded to a negative 0.44 and a positive 0.93. So I am 95% confident the true difference between the proportion of illiterate Qatar men falls between 4% lower and 9.3% higher than the women. Okay, so the true difference, we're looking at the difference between the two, and that's what the question, find the interval for the difference between the proportion of illiterate Qatar men it's either going to be 4.4% lower or 9.3% higher than the women. So since we see that, it makes sense that we rejected up here, that we failed to reject, that they were not right up here, that this is a possibility. There's not enough evidence to reject it though. So I want you to notice, here's my interval, a negative and a positive, which in between that, there's a 0 in there, which means there could be no difference whatsoever between the two. There could be no difference between the two. So that's something to look at. That's something to think about. I hope this helps, and I'll soon have this posted.